Chapter 194, The Royal Breakfast. Halford did not immediately close his eyes in slumber. Although his education had been miserably neglected, he possessed good natural abilities, and his reflections at times were of a far more philosophical nature than could have been anticipated. The gorgeous scenes which he had just witnessed now led him to meditate upon the horrible contrasts which existed elsewhere, not only in the great metropolis, but throughout the United Kingdom, and many, very many, of which he himself had seen with his own eyes and felt with his own experience. At that moment when festivity was highest and pleasure was most exciting in the regal halls, there were mothers in naked attics, dark cellars, or even houseless in the open streets, mothers who pressed their famished little ones to their bosoms and wondered whether a mouthful of food would ever pass their lips again. While the royal table groaned beneath the weight of golden vessels and the choicest luxuries which earth's fruitfulness, heaven's bounty, or man's ingenuity could supply, while the raciest produce of fertile vineyards sparkled in the crystal cups, at that same period how many thousands of that exalted lady's subjects moistened their sorry crust with tears wrung from them by the consciousness of ill-requited toil and the pinching gripe of bitter poverty. Of all this Halford thought as he lay concealed in the lumber room of the royal dwelling, but at length sleep overtook him. It was still dark when he awoke. At first he thought he must have slumbered for many hours, that a day had passed, and that another night had come. But he felt too little refreshed to remain many instants in that opinion. Moreover, as he watched the window, he observed a faint, faint gleam of light, or rather a mitigation of the intenseness of the gloom. Without, and slowly appearing, he knew that the dawn was at hand. He was nearly frozen in that cheerless room where he had slept. His teeth chattered, his limbs were benumbed. He longed for some new excitement to elevate his drooping spirits, and thus impart physical warmth to his frame. Suddenly a thought struck him. He would penetrate into the royal breakfast-room. He knew that the Queen and Prince Albert frequently partook of the morning meal together, and he longed to listen to their conversation when thus tete-a-tete. Scarcely had he conceived this project when he resolved to execute it. The interior of the palace, even to its most private apartments and chambers, was, as we have stated before, perfectly familiar to him. Stealing from the place where he had slept, he proceeded with marvelous caution to the point of his present destination, and in about 10 minutes he reached the breakfast-room in safety, and a friendly sofa became Halford's hiding-place. Shortly after 8 o'clock, a domestic entered with the morning ministerial paper, which he laid upon the table and then withdrew. 5 minutes elapsed, when the door was thrown open and the Queen entered, attended by 2 ladies. These were almost immediately dismissed, and Victoria seated herself near the fire to read the journal. But scarcely had she opened it ere Prince Albert made his appearance, followed by a gentleman in waiting who humbly saluted Her Majesty and retired. The Queen and her consort were alone, or at least supposed themselves to be, and their conversation so flowed without restraint. But such an empire, such a despotism, does the habitual etiquette of courts establish over the natural freedom of the human mind, that even the best and most tender feelings of the heart are to a certain extent subdued and oppressed by that chilling influence. The royal pair were affectionate to each other, still their tenderness was not of that lively, unembarrassed, free, and cordial nature which subsists at the domestic hearth elsewhere. There seemed to be a barrier between the frank and open interchange of their thoughts, and even though that barrier were no thicker than gauze, still it existed. Their words were to some degree measured, scarcely perceptible so, it is true. Nevertheless, the fact was apparent in the least degree, and the effect was also in the least degree unpleasant. The Queen was authoritative in the enunciation of her opinion upon any subject, and if the Prince differed from her, he expressed himself with restraint. In fact, he did not feel himself his wife's equal. Could a listener, who did not see them as they spoke, have deadened his ears to those intonations of their voices which marked their respective sex, and have judged only by their words, he would have thought that the Queen was the husband and the Prince the wife. At this time in the Victorian era, it would be very unusual for the husband in a marriage to defer to his wife. Interesting. That would have an odd impact on a marriage, right? To have the wife be the queen of the entire nation and have, at this point, so much influence over it. And her husband feeling that there's not an equal footing between them in their marriage. Like, obviously there isn't in the government or in their standing there, but at least in their marriage, you ought to feel as if you're equals to each other. The Prince appeared to be very amiable, very intelligent, but totally inexperienced in the ways of the world. The Queen exhibited much natural ability and an elegant taste. Nevertheless, she also seemed lamentably ignorant of the everyday incidents of life. We mean that the royal pair manifested a reluctance to believe in those melancholy occurrences which characterize the condition of the industrious millions. It was not the result of indifference, but sheer ignorance. Indeed, it would necessarily seem difficult for those who were so surrounded by every luxury to conceive that such a fearful contrast as literal starvation could possibly exist. But let us hear that illustrious pair converse. Their language will to some extent serve as an index to their minds. Melbourne informed me last evening, said the Queen, that he trembles for the safety of his cabinet during the approaching session. The Carlton Club is particularly active, and the Conservative Party has acquired great strength during the recess. What would be the consequence of a ministerial defeat? Inquired Prince Albert. A dissolution, of course, answered the Queen. I must candidly confess that I should regret to see the Conservative Party succeed to power. All the principal lords and ladies of our household would be immediately changed. The Whigs, however, have certainly grown unpopular, and there appears to be some distress in the country. The very article on which my eyes rested when I took up this paper ere now is headed Dreadful Suicide Through Extreme Destitution. Beneath, in the same column, is an article entitled Infanticide and Suicide of the Murderess Through Literal Starvation. The next column contains a long narrative which I have not had time to read, but which is headed Suicide Through Dread of the Workhouse. On this page, continued the Queen, turning the paper upon the table, there is an article entitled Death from Starvation, another headed Dreadful Conditions of the Spitalfields Weavers, a third called Starving State of the Paisley Mechanics, a fourth entitled Awful Distress in the Manufacturing Districts. I perceived numerous short paragraphs, all announcing similar calamities. The English papers are always full of such accounts, observed the Prince. And yet I would have you know that England is the richest, most prosperous, and happiest country on the face of the earth, returned the Queen somewhat impatiently. You must not take these accounts literally as you read them. My ministers assure me that they are greatly exaggerated. It appears, as the matter has been explained to me, that the persons who furnish these narratives are remunerated according to quantity, and they therefore amplify the details as much as possible. It's interesting, they've set up that the Queen has a hard time even conceiving of the idea of people starving in her country because she's so surrounded by evidences of prosperity. I think that's often a problem that we have because we don't necessarily see someone else's struggles and sufferings. It can be hard to believe that they exist. It's a good warning to be careful of doing that. Still, those accounts must be to a certain extent based on truth, said Prince Albert half inquiringly. Not nearly so much as you imagine. My ministers have satisfied me on that head, and they must know better than you. Take, for instance, the article headed Dreadful Condition of the Spitalfields Weavers. You may there read that the weavers are in an actual state of starvation. This is only newspaper metaphor. The weavers are not so well off as they wish to be. Perhaps they have not meat every day, perhaps only 3 or 4 times a week, but they assuredly have plenty of bread and potatoes, because bread and potatoes are cheap. I thought that you intended to discountenance the importance of sovereign silks by ordering all the ladies of the court to wear dresses of English material, observed Prince Albert after a pause. Such was my intention, answered the Queen, but the ladies about me dropped so many hints on the subject that I was compelled to rescind the command. This is connected because if she had in fact required that her ladies-in-waiting or the ladies of the court wear clothes that were made of English fabric, then the Spitalfields weavers would be doing more business than they were, and their condition would be better. So that's why Prince Albert was like, didn't you just, deny them a whole bunch of business? And then she's saying, well, I was going to, but the ladies were like, ew. We want to wear fancy silk from other places. I must confess that I was not sorry to find an excuse for so doing, for I greatly prefer French silks and French dressmakers. But let me make an observation upon this article, which is headed, Suicide Through Dread of the Workhouse. I spoke to the Secretary of State a few days ago upon the subject of workhouses, and he assured me that they are very comfortable places. He declared that the people do not know when they are well off, and that they require to be managed like refractory children. He quite convinced me that all he said was perfectly correct, and I really begin to think that the people are very obstinate, dissatisfied, and insolent. They are most enthusiastic in their demonstrations towards their sovereign, remarked the Prince. And naturally so, exclaimed Victoria. Am I not their queen? Are they not my subjects? Do I not rule over them? All the happiness, prosperity, and enjoyments which they possess emanate from the throne. They would be very ungrateful if they did not reverence, nay, adore their sovereign. Oh, of course, said Prince Albert. In Germany, any individual who exhibits the least coldness toward his sovereign is immediately marked as a traitor. And in this country, the Home Secretary keeps a list of disaffected persons, observed the Queen. But their number is very limited, at least so I am assured. My ministers are constantly informing me of the proofs of loyalty and devotion which the people manifest towards me. If this were a Roman Catholic nation, they would no doubt place my image next to the Virgin in their chapels. If it were an idolatrous country, my effigy would surely stand amongst the gods and goddesses. It is very pleasant, Albert, to be so much loved by my subjects, to be positively worshipped by them. The prince replied with a compliment, which it is not worth while to record. The royal pair then conversed upon a variety of topics which would afford little interest to the reader, and shortly after 9 Her Majesty withdrew. Prince Albert remained in the room to read the newspaper. Henry Halford had listened with almost breathless attention to the conversation which we have recorded. The prince had drawn his chair more closely to the fire after the Queen left the room, and he was now sitting within a couple yards of the sofa beneath which Halford lay concealed. The potboy gently drew aside the drapery which hung from the framework of the sofa to the floor and gazed long and intently on the prince. His look was one in which envy, animosity, and admiration were strangely blended. He thought within himself, "Why are you so exalted and I so abased? And yet your graceful person, your intelligent countenance, your handsome features seem to fit you for such an elevated position. Nevertheless, if I had had your advantages of education—" The meditations of the presumptuous youth were suddenly and most disagreeably checked. The prince abruptly threw aside the paper, and his eyes fell on the human countenance that was gazing up at him from beneath the sofa. "Oh, no! He got caught!" His Royal Highness uttered an exclamation of surprise, not altogether unmingled with alarm, and his first impulse was to stretch out his hand toward the bell rope, but, yielding to a second thought, he advanced to the sofa, exclaiming, "Come forth, whoever you may be." Then the miserable potboy dragged himself from his hiding-place, and in another moment stood, pale and trembling, in the presence of the prince. "Who are you?" demanded his Royal Highness in a stern tone. "What means this intrusion? How came you hither?" Henry Halford fell at the feet of the prince and confessed that, urged by an invincible curiosity, he had entered the palace on the preceding evening, but said nothing of his previous visits. For a few moments Prince Albert seemed uncertain how to act. He was doubtless hesitating between the alternatives of handing the intruder over to the officers of justice or of allowing him to depart unmolested. After a pause, he questioned Halford more closely and seemed satisfied by the youth's assurance that he had really entered the palace through motives of curiosity and not for any dishonest purpose. The prince accordingly determined to be merciful. "I am willing," he said, "to forgive the present offense. You shall be suffered to depart, but I warn you that a repetition of the act will lead to a severe punishment. Follow me." The prince led the way to an anteroom where a domestic was in waiting. "Conduct this lad as privately as you can from the palace," said the Royal Highness. "Ask him no questions, and mention not the incident elsewhere." The prince withdrew, and the lackey led Henry Halford through various turnings in the palace to the servants' door opening into Pimlico. Thus was the potboy ignominiously, I do know how to talk, I promise. Thus was the potboy ignominiously expelled from the palace, and never, never in his life had he felt more thoroughly degraded, more profoundly abased, more contemptible in his own eyes than on the present occasion. Okay, so he did get caught, but the prince was merciful to him. So now we'll see if he ever goes back and what will happen with him and Cranky Jem and the Resurrection Man. And we haven't heard from several of our other characters in a while, so we'll see.